You probably know, at least I hope you know, that the United States entered World War II after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and the address that Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave in the wake of the Pearl Harbor attack is one of the most important speeches in the minds of a lot of scholars of public address of the 20th century. And because it's a historic document, we have a couple of drafts of it. So, what I want to do is I want to give you enough historical context that you have an idea what Roosevelt was up against, and then we're going to look at the first draft of the speech, and we're going to look at and think about some of the edits that he made. Roosevelt wrote most of his speeches with two senior speechwriters, Samuel Rosenman and Robert Sherwood. Other staffers would help out, but those two were his go-tos. Usually, a major speech would take anywhere between 3 and 10 days. And what Rosenman and Sherwood said was Roosevelt would go over and over the speeches and he would fiddle with the wording until it fit his mouth very comfortably. They said by the time he approved a speech, he generally had it memorized. So this Pearl Harbor happened in the wake, not immediately after, but a number of years after the end of World War I, about, I guess, 22 years later. American opinion was that United States participation in World War I had been a mistake. It was very popular in 1941 to join local peace societies and to speak out publicly for war to be abolished. This is all pre-Hitler, so this is pre the understanding that appeasement does not make a threat go away. So Roosevelt was pretty hemmed in. War broke out in Europe, and Roosevelt had to enforce the neutrality laws that had been passed. But he built up the military. He kept in his speeches calling the United States the arsenal of democracy and trying to frame what he was trying to do, trying to mold American public opinion so that they would support that understanding of what America's mission in the world was. Most people knew that relations between the United States and Japan were not good and that war was at least a possibility, but public opinion was still squarely against it. They also knew that a number of years earlier, even before World War One, back in the 1900s, before 1910, there had been a war between Japan and Russia, which Japan had surprised the world by winning. They won chiefly because of the opening salvo, the Battle of Port Arthur, which was a sneak attack. It was a crippling opening move, and Roosevelt's cousin and prior president, Teddy Roosevelt, actually served as the mediator to negotiate the peace settlement between Japan and Russia. So Japan had a history of surprise attacks. In 1937, Japan and China went to war, and for the most part, people in the United States wanted no part of it. But then the attack on Nanjing happened. The attack on Nanjing is called the Rape of Nanjing because Japanese soldiers, as they moved through the city, were very, very violent and committed a lot of atrocities, and there was a lot of media coverage of it. There was an American Navy ship, the USS Panay, and it was sent to evacuate American citizens from Nanjing, and the Japanese bombed the ship, and 3 people died. What that did is it swung American public opinion to the side of the Chinese in that conflict. But what we were still talking about was neutrality with just a little overlay of sympathy for the Chinese. After 1939, Japan saw an opportunity with Britain and France. Their colonies in Asia and across the Pacific seemed like easy pickings for the Japanese because Britain and France were busy with the war in Europe. So Japan signed the Axis Treaty with Germany and started invading those colonies, and Roosevelt was not pleased with this. But the American public still were not going to tolerate any response that had any kind of teeth in it. Roosevelt imposed economic sanctions, finally getting to the point of a complete trade embargo. All trade was cut off between the United States and Japan, and in particular, this meant the Japanese military only had enough oil to last for a few months. If they ran out, then they would have to break off the war with China. So the Japanese leadership made a decision. If we reach an impasse in negotiations to lift the embargo, then we have to go to war with the United States because we have to invade and take Indonesia because that's where we can get oil to continue our war. Pearl Harbor happened on a Sunday afternoon, or at least Sunday afternoon, Washington, D.C. time, and Roosevelt was meeting with his chief advisor, Harry Hopkins. He was just finishing up lunch, and he planned, when he got things squared away with Hopkins, to spend the afternoon on his stamp collection, just relaxing. It was Sunday, and then the phone rang. The White House operator said that it was Navy Secretary Frank Knox who insisted on speaking to the president. And Secretary Knox was reporting Pearl Harbor was under attack. The first reaction of the White House was surprise at where it was because Pearl Harbor was a fortress. What they had expected was the Japanese might attack the Philippines, they might attack Indochina or Thailand or maybe the Russian Far East. As a matter of fact, Harry Hopkins, who was meeting with the president at that moment, he said, no, 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 this has to be a mistake. In January of that year, the American ambassador to Japan had reported back that Japan was planning a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. But Roosevelt's advisors said that makes no sense, and they insisted if an attack came, it would have to come in the Philippines. But we know now that since 1931, for the previous 10 years, a question on the final exam for the Japanese Naval Academy had been, how would you carry out a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor? Within half an hour, they had a phone line open to the governor of Hawaii who briefed them. While he was on the phone, another wave of Japanese planes came over and they could hear the bombing. So security was increased around the White House and they began talking about building a makeshift bomb shelter under the Treasury building. Meanwhile, the first reports were spreading across the nation, some by word of mouth. Some people had family in Hawaii. Some of it was coming by radio report. You may not be old enough to remember it, but it was, some of you may be, because this is both a daytime and an ADP class, but it was very similar to September 11th. People had to start thinking about what it was going to be like to be at war because they just took it for granted. Okay, we're going to war against the Japanese. And I also have to say, World War II was the last war the United States participated in that we actually declared, which means it was still the era of declared wars and of honorable behavior in a fight. The feeling that day was shock and anger to a degree we really can't imagine today. Now, that said, there's a history in the United States of overwhelming victory following early setback. There's General Custer at Little Bighorn, and then the battles that took place in the wake of that. There's the blowing up of the USS Maine and the Spanish-American War that followed from that. Roosevelt's speechwriters, Rosenman and Sherwood, were in New York, and Roosevelt decided the speech could not wait until they got back. So he called in his chief secretary, Grace Tully, and he dictated the entire first draft himself. Taking long, long drags on his cigarette because he was a smoker, he started dictating it in just this perfectly calm tone, stating the punctuation he wanted as he went, the same way he would dictate replies to his mail. Tully typed it up, and then he and his assistants went to work editing it. Sumner Welles, who was the Undersecretary of State, told him that he had to give a longer speech explaining the background. Cordell Hull told him, who was the Secretary of State, told him he needed to be like Churchill and put the attack in historical context, and he looked at both of them and said, absolutely not. The previous declaration of war had been, when the United States entered World War I, the address requesting the declaration of war had been given by Woodrow Wilson, and the speech was abstract and academic, and Wilson talked for over half an hour. You can find Roosevelt's entire speech linked in Beacon Learning, and it's about 500 words long, and it's only a couple of minutes long. It's 1/7 the length of Wilson's speech. So now let's have a look. And here you can pause the video, and you can read this over, and we will talk about it in some detail. Now he's using passive voice. The United States of America was attacked. Why do you think that he would phrase it that way? What most people who study this speech say is that it was to keep the United States, the party that had been wronged, as the center of the speech, not to talk in the opening part of the speech about the government of Japan, but to keep talking about the United States, what had happened to the United States, and to keep his audience thinking about the United States. Now, Woodrow Wilson, in his Declaration of War speech, used idealistic language, that the United States would fight to make the world safe for democracy, that it was just like the Great Commission. It was an appeal to our better selves, to our sense of duty. Roosevelt wrote a fundamentally different speech. The only thing he wanted to do was ignite anger and ride that wave. So this is the first draft, but then here's the second draft. A date which will live in infamy. That became unofficially the title of the speech. The date which will live in infamy speech. And that was a Roosevelt invention. The United States was suddenly and deliberately attacked. suddenly is a lot more violent. There's a lot more motion to it than simultaneously. Continuing the conversations is a lot more of a tongue twister. It's a lot more mushy than the United States was still in conversations. The lines about places being attacked were added as the updates came in. They weren't in the first draft because as of the time they did the first draft, all those places had not yet been attacked. Hong Kong, Guam, Midway. They did know about the Philippines when they did the first draft. They added it when they added the others. Now the line near the bottom, with the confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounded determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God. That was Harry Hopkins' suggestion. Roosevelt was a devout Christian, but at first he didn't see the connection to invoking God's help. And to jump back to the first page for just a moment, in the second paragraph, about 3 lines down, Hawaii and the Philippines getting edited down to Oahu. When Roosevelt was giving the speech, in the middle of delivering it, he changed it to the American island of Oahu, because the connection he made at that moment was many people on the mainland did not know that Oahu was an American territory. It wasn't a state yet. And if you were to ask Americans today to list off all the territories the United States has in the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, most people couldn't do it. So he had to clarify that the Japanese weren't just attacking territory out in the Pacific that was allied with us, but that it was our territory, and these were our people. So that's a little bit of the background and the foundation of what went into this speech. And you can see from the changes, some of the changes are to make more of a direct connection between speaker and audience. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost is a lot more of an emotional connection than very many American lives have been lost. Some of the changes were about making it fit in Roosevelt's mouth more comfortably. Up in the third paragraph, the attack was deliberately planned, just worked better than that these attacks were deliberately planned. And adding, or even weeks, it could be speculation about how far back the planning went, but really what's more likely is that just made the rhythm of the sentence work better. Deliberately planned many days or even weeks ago. So, one of the more influential speeches of the 20th century, and we saw how it came out of the moment, and we saw how it went from Roosevelt's first draft, written from out of his head, and how, with changes to align it with its purpose, with changes to make it fit his speaking style, and with some changes suggested by his associates, it became the draft of the speech that he would later give.